The sun was sliding down behind the old ridgeline when the first sign of trouble appeared on the dusty road leading into Willow Creek. It was a sound so strange that folks sitting outside the general store lifted their heads at the same time. The town was used to the creak of wagon wheels, the murmur of travelers, and the distant calls of ranch hands finishing their day, but this was different. A sharp, desperate whinny cut through the warm air, carrying a kind of fear people didn't hear from horses unless something was terribly wrong. Even old-timers who had lived through storms, stampedes, and outlaw shootouts felt their chests tighten at the cry. Something was coming, and it wasn't coming slow. A chestnut Murray burst into view at the far end of the street. Dust swirled around her legs as she fought to stay upright on the hard road. Her coat, once bright, looked worn and streaked with sweat. Her sides heaved with each breath, and her ears flicked back like she was searching for anyone who might understand what she was trying to say. Folks stepped back instinctively, startled by the sight. A wild horse in town wasn't unheard of, but one running straight toward people, saddled and trembling, was enough to make even the calmest person take a cautious step away. What made the scene stranger was the small white cloth pinned to the saddle, catching the wind like a signal. Nobody in Willow Creek had ever seen a wild horse carrying something that looked like a message. Some whispered that maybe she'd slipped from the hands of travelers who had passed through earlier that week. Others guessed she belonged to a nearby ranch and had broken loose. But the way she moved, the way her eyes flashed with fear and determination, made it hard to believe she belonged to anyone at all. She wasn't just lost. She was begging. The Murray slowed near the watering trough, legs shaky. She tossed her head toward the people gathering around as if trying to speak without words. Folks exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being asked for help by a creature that lived free on the plains. The horse dipped her head toward the cloth pinned at her side, then looked back up at them. It was as clear as any voice. She needed someone to understand her, and fast. A few people stepped closer, but most held back. Wild horses weren't known for trusting humans, and approaching one in distress could end badly for both sides. The blacksmith murmured to his apprentice that they should wait for someone who knew horses better. The baker's wife clutched her shawl, whispering that something didn't feel right about the whole thing. The sheriff stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, studying the horse with narrowed eyes. Even he didn't move forward. That was when someone pushed through the small crowd, walking with steady, careful steps. Folks turned to look, surprised to see who it was. Most expected the sheriff or one of the ranch hands or maybe a traveling wrangler. But the person stepping forward wasn't any of those. They were someone the town knew, yet rarely noticed. Someone folks passed every day without paying much mind. And that made the moment even more startling. The person approached the Mare with quiet confidence, the kind that came from patience rather than reputation. The Mare's ears flicked forward. Her breathing slowed just enough to show she sensed something different about this newcomer. The street fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause as everyone watched the two meet in the middle of the dusty road. The person reached out a hand, stopping just short of touching the Mare. It was a gesture of respect, a silent promise that nothing harmful was coming. The Mare took a small step closer, her trembling eased. She lowered her head, allowing the stranger to rest a gentle hand against her cheek. A wave of relief rippled through the watching crowd, though none of them could understand how trust had formed so quickly. It felt like watching a door open to a place none of them had ever been invited. The stranger examined the saddle and the cloth pinned to it. There were faint smudges of dirt on the fabric and a small tear near one corner like it had been caught on something sharp. The stranger brushed off a bit of dust and turned the cloth slightly, studying whatever message might be hidden there. Before they could lift it fully, the Mare jerked her head up again, looking toward the far hills with wide, pleading eyes. Something was out there. Something the Mare desperately wanted them to see. The stranger placed a calming hand on her shoulder, but the horse seemed torn between staying and running back the way she came. Her hooves shifted restlessly. Her tail swished in agitation. Folks began murmuring again. If she was running from danger, what kind of danger forced a wild horse to seek help from humans? Outlaws, a trapped rider, a fire somewhere in the tall grass? The questions spread like sparks, each one making the whole situation feel heavier. The stranger must have sensed the rising edge of panic in the mare. They loosened the strap holding the cloth and gently pulled it free. The wind caught the fabric, but the stranger held tight, unfolding it as the crowd leaned in. A few people stepped closer, trying to catch a glimpse. But before anyone could make sense of the markings on the cloth, the mare whinnied sharply, pushing her muzzle insistently against the stranger's shoulder. The message mattered, but so did something else. Something she needed to show, not just tell. The stranger looked from the mare to the cloth, then to the distant hills glowing gold under the falling sun. The wind carried the faint smell of sagebrush and dust, but there was something else hidden beneath it, something faint, something wrong. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly as they lifted the cloth again, this time noticing a faint streak along the edge. Not paint, not dirt, something that made their chest tighten. The mare stomped her front hoof, impatient and frightened. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care about the crowd forming around her. She cared only that someone would understand her message before it was too late. The stranger finally spoke, voice steady but low enough that only those closest could hear. The words sent a ripple through the gathered townsfolk. Whatever was written on the cloth wasn't simple, it wasn't harmless. And it wasn't something Willow Creek could ignore. While the crowd waited for the stranger to explain, the mare threw her head toward the hills again. Her whole body leaned in that direction, her muscles tensed. She was ready to run, but she wouldn't leave without the one person she had chosen to trust. The message wasn't a plea for random aid. It was a call for someone specific, someone willing to step forward when everyone else hesitated. The stranger folded the cloth with care and slipped it into their jacket. Then they placed a hand on the mare's neck, giving her a silent answer she seemed to understand. She lowered her head briefly, as if relieved, though her legs still trembled with urgency. The sheriff stepped forward, trying to ask what the cloth meant. The townsfolk waited for the stranger to explain, but the stranger didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, they turned toward the hills, eyes fixed on whatever lay hidden beyond the fading light. The mare pawed at the dirt, ready to lead the way. The crowd held its breath as the stranger swung onto the saddle, letting the mare take their weight with surprising steadiness. The horse lifted her head, ears pricked toward the growing shadows stretching across the land. For a heartbeat, the whole town stood still. The mare began to move, and the stranger let her guide the pace, heading straight toward the unknown. People watched them ride toward the horizon, the fading sun throwing a long shadow behind them. The cloth in the stranger's jacket shifted with the wind as if trying to speak on its own, carrying a warning the town was not yet ready to hear. Whatever lay ahead in those hills, it wasn't waiting patiently. The mare carried the stranger out of Willow Creek at a steady pace, though every so often she flicked her ears back as if checking to make sure the rider was still with her. The sun had dipped low enough for the sky to take on that quiet orange glow that always came before nightfall on the plains. The shadows stretched long across the ground, bending behind them like dark fingers pulling at their heels. Each hoofbeat pressed deeper into the dust, and although the road ahead looked calm, the stranger couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in their stomach. There was danger out here, the mare could sense it. And now the stranger could too. A soft breeze pushed across the land, carrying faint smells of dry grass, worn soil, and the distant hint of smoke. Not the thick kind that came from a fire, but a light touch, like something had burned earlier, and the scent still lingered. The stranger shifted in the saddle and brushed a hand across the mare's neck. Her muscles tightened beneath their touch, but she didn't slow. Whatever she wanted to show them was close enough that stopping wasn't an option. Behind them, Willow Creek grew smaller. The stores, the sheriff's office, the wooden boardwalks, all faded into the warm haze of dusk. The stranger thought about the crowd that had gathered, their worried eyes following the pair until they were no longer visible. Folks in town trusted the stranger, even if they didn't always say so. They came for help in quiet moments, when they needed someone who didn't ask many questions. The stranger didn't know whether that was a gift or a burden, but right now it had placed them alone in the middle of the open plains with a wild horse who carried a message no one could ignore. The stranger kept one hand pressed to the folded cloth in their jacket. The faint streak near the edge bothered them more than they wanted to admit. The markings on the fabric had been hurried, uneven. Someone had written it knowing time was running out. The message wasn't long, but it was clear enough to raise questions that cut deep. The stranger had hoped the Mary might slow down long enough for them to fully understand the meaning behind it, but she seemed determined to keep going. As the town disappeared completely behind them, the Mary veered off the main road and took a narrow trail that wound between patches of sagebrush. Her ears stayed pointed forward, her stride long and sure even as the light faded. The stranger's eyes adjusted to the darker tones of the land. The hills ahead rose gently, rolling out like waves frozen in time. Somewhere beyond them was the truth, or at least the start of it. They rode in silence for a while. Only the sound of hooves and the soft creak of the saddle filled the air. With every mile they covered, the stranger tried to piece together what they knew. A wild horse appearing in town was unusual. A wild horse wearing a saddle was more unusual. And a wild horse carrying a message was unheard of. Someone had been with her. Someone had been in enough trouble to send her running. The stranger wondered if the mare had belonged to a traveler camping near the hills. People passing through often rested under the cottonwoods that lined the creek out that way, waiting for cooler hours before continuing west. Maybe something had happened there. The idea made the stranger grip the saddle horn a little tighter. They reached the base of the first hill, and the mare slowed at last. She tossed her head and snorted, scanning the area with wide eyes. The stranger leaned forward, peering into the gathering shadows. The grass rustled softly in the breeze, and every shift of movement made their senses sharpen. The mare's tension grew, but she didn't shy away. Instead, she turned toward a faint trail leading up the hill and began climbing. The path was narrow and uneven. Rocks shifted under her hooves, and the stranger balanced carefully to avoid slipping. The higher they went, the more the land behind them opened up. Willow Creek looked like a small cluster of lights far in the distance now. The stranger focused ahead, trusting the mare's instincts. Near the top of the hill, the mare halted. Her breathing was rough, her chest rising hard. She looked to the right toward a patch of brush where the grass had been pressed down. The stranger dismounted and stepped quietly through the dry stalks, kneeling beside the disturbed ground. Something had happened here. The earth was uneven, with small indentations from boots and deeper marks from the mare's hooves. She had been here earlier, maybe trying to help someone who had fallen or struggled. The stranger placed a hand on the ground and felt the faint warmth still trapped in the soil. Whatever had taken place, it hadn't been long ago. The mare gave a soft whine behind them, her tone low and uneasy. The stranger turned to find her staring toward the ridge on the opposite side of the hill. Her body stiffened, her ears pinned forward. Something else was waiting. The stranger stood and brushed off their hands, then walked back to the mare. They ran a calming palm along her shoulder, but even that didn't quiet her trembling. She wanted to move again. She needed to. They mounted once more. The mare took off as soon as the reins settled in the stranger's hands, heading toward the ridge. The path narrowed again, curving around scattered boulders. The last light of the setting sun stretched thin across the land, and the first hints of night touched the sky. A few birds called out as they settled in for the evening, but their cries were sharp, unsettled. Nature felt uneasy, as if the land sensed something it couldn't escape. As they reached the top of the ridge, a faint cluster of trees came into view below. Cottonwoods, just as the stranger had expected. Their leaves moved in the wind, whispering against each other. The mare slowed and then stopped entirely, refusing to go farther. She lifted her head high, nostrils flaring. The stranger knew instantly that this was the place she had been trying to reach. A faint shape rested near the tree line. Not large enough to be a wagon, not moving enough to be a person standing. The stranger narrowed their eyes, studying the outline. It didn't shift or sway, it simply lay there, still and quiet. The mare wouldn't step closer. She pawed at the dirt, frustrated but afraid. The stranger slid off the saddle again, landing softly on the ground. They gave the mare a reassuring pat, then walked toward the trees alone. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the edge of the cottonwoods, they found signs of a small camp. A bedroll spread out, a lantern tipped on its side, a tin cup overturned in the dirt. Everything looked abandoned in a hurry. The stranger knelt beside the bedroll and touched the fabric. It wasn't cold yet. Someone had been resting here not long ago, maybe the same person who had pinned the message to the Mare's saddle. The faint shape they had seen from the ridge turned out to be a worn coat draped over a fallen log, not a body. Relief washed briefly through the stranger's chest, but the feeling didn't last. There was no sign of the person themselves, only the remains of their camp. The stranger checked the ground for tracks. There were several overlapping footprints, some deep, some scattered. They spread out in different directions, like the person had moved quickly, maybe even stumbled. The stranger followed a set leading away from the camp, but the trail ended near the creek where water had washed the prints into soft, shapeless marks. A cold chill edged into the air as night came fully. The stranger stepped back, trying to decide whether to search farther. But the Mare gave a sudden sharp cry behind them, a sound filled with panic. The stranger spun around, heart pounding. The Mare was backing away from the ridge, her head whipping toward the darkness behind the trees. She wanted the stranger to return immediately, and the urgency in her eyes left no room for argument. The stranger rushed back to her side and set a hand on her neck. Her pulse was racing. Something in the dark was close enough to frighten her in a way the camp hadn't. The stranger looked over their shoulder, scanning the shadows beyond the trees. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched pressed against the night like a weight. Whatever had happened here wasn't finished. And whatever had chased the Mare's rider, if there had been one, might still be out there, waiting. The stranger mounted again, and the Mare turned sharply, heading away from the cottonwoods. She kept her pace quick but careful, moving along the ridge as if she knew a safer route. The stranger didn't try to guide her. They trusted her sense of danger more than their own. When they reached the far side of the ridge, the Mare slowed again and looked back. The camp was now hidden by the hill, lost in the growing darkness. But the Unis remained strong and steady. The stranger touched the cloth in their jacket, feeling its weight, its message, its warning. They still didn't fully understand what the markings meant. But the fear on the Mare's face and the emptiness of the abandoned camp said enough. Something had happened in those hills, something far bigger than a simple accident or a lost traveler. And the message carried by that brave Mare wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The night deepened and the Mare kept moving, as if guiding the stranger toward a truth that had yet to reveal itself. The air felt colder, the plains seemed quieter. And the tension that had started in Willow Creek had grown even stronger. Whatever awaited them beyond the next hill was coming into clearer focus. And it wasn't going to keep hiding for long. The Mare moved with a tense steadiness, guiding the stranger along a narrow path that cut through the rolling hills. The night sky had settled in full now, brushed with starlight that flickered like distant campfires. The stranger felt every sound around them sharpen. Each rustle in the tall grass, every shift of wind between the rocks, made their senses tighten. The plains at night were usually calm, but tonight felt different. The land was holding its breath, waiting. The Mare's steps slowed only when they reached a small hollow between two ridges. She stopped completely, turning her head toward the stranger with a soft nudge, urging them to dismount. The stranger slid out of the saddle and let their boots settle on the cool earth. The Mare stayed close, almost protective. She wasn't just guiding them now. She was standing with them. The hollow was quiet, almost too still. A line of cottonwoods bordered one edge, and the moonlight filtered through their leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. The stranger crouched to study the dirt, running their fingers along faint marks. Some were hoof prints, others looked like they had been made by boots dragged through the soil. The Mare stepped closer, lowering her head to the same place, her breath warm against the stranger's arm. It was clear someone had passed through here, someone who had struggled. The stranger rose slowly, trying to fit together the scattered clues. The message in the cloth, the abandoned camp, the strange tension in the air, the way the Mare refused to leave them behind. They looked into her dark eyes, searching for understanding. The Mare touched her muzzle to their shoulder in a soft, pleading way, then turned toward the next ridge. She wanted to keep moving, but she also wanted the stranger to understand something important. The stranger followed her gaze and noticed the faint glow of a fire beyond the ridge. It was small, barely visible, but enough to draw the eye. The Mare hesitated, as if torn. She shifted her hooves and breathed out sharply. The stranger gave her a reassuring pat and whispered that they would check it out. She stayed behind as they climbed the ridge alone. At the top, the stranger dropped low, keeping their movements quiet. The glow came from a small clearing below. A single fire crackled near the center, and two figures stood on opposite sides of it. Their voices carried faintly, sharp and tense, carried by the wind through the still night air. The stranger leaned forward, listening. The words weren't clear enough to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. These weren't travelers sharing stories by the fire. These were people arguing, and the argument felt dangerous. One figure gestured toward the hills where the Mare had led the stranger earlier. The other shook their head, as if refusing whatever plan was being suggested. The stranger eased back, heart beating harder. Whoever these people were, they were connected to the camp and the Mare's distress. The message pinned to the saddle had mentioned danger in the hills, and now the stranger could feel that danger in every breath of wind. A sudden crack from behind made the stranger turn quickly, startled. The Mare had climbed partway up the ridge, unable to stay away despite her fear. Her eyes widened as she saw the fire and the figures below. She stepped backward, trembling. The stranger motioned for her to stay low. She obeyed, though her breathing stayed unsteady. The tension below grew louder. One of the figures kicked dirt over the fire, dimming its glow. The other grabbed something from the ground, and the stranger caught a glimpse of fabric that looked far too familiar. The folded cloth from the saddle had a tear on one side. The cloth in the stranger's jacket had that same tear. Whoever had written the message had not done it in secret. They had done it under duress. That torn edge had been a sign of a struggle. The stranger's stomach tightened as the second figure held up the cloth and shook it angrily before tossing it aside. They began pacing, their voice rising with frustration. Whatever they were looking for, they hadn't found it. And they weren't giving up. The stranger lifted their eyes from the clearing and scanned the surrounding hills. If these two were part of something larger, others might be hiding in the dark, waiting for orders. The Mare sensed the danger and nudged the stranger again, urging them to retreat. The stranger agreed silently and backed down the ridge, careful not to disturb the rocks. When they reached the bottom, the Mare pushed her head against the stranger's arm as if checking they were not hurt. The stranger stroked her neck, steadying her as much as themselves. They had learned more, but it had only deepened the mystery. Someone was out there searching for something, angry and desperate, and the person the Mare had once been with was nowhere to be seen. They moved farther into the hollow, away from the ridge. The Mare kept close, her ears flicking toward every sound. The stranger began thinking through possibilities. Maybe the missing person had been captured, or maybe they were hiding, injured, and unable to move. The Mare had tried to get help in town, which meant she believed that person was still alive. The stranger clung to that hope. As they searched the area, a soft rustle emerged from the woods. The Mare froze. The stranger held the reins tighter, waiting. A moment later, a shadow broke through the darkness. A man stumbled out from behind a fallen tree, his steps uneven. He wasn't one of the figures from the fire. His clothes were dirt-stained, his face scratched, and his eyes held a mixture of exhaustion and fear. The Mare reacted instantly, letting out a soft, desperate cry. The man stopped, lifting his head at the sound. His expression shifted from confusion to relief. He whispered something, reaching a hand toward her. She stepped closer, trembling but eager, brushing her muzzle against his arm. The stranger watched quietly, heart pounding as the pieces fell into place. This was the person the Mare had been trying to save. But before the stranger could speak, the man raised a hand, signaling silence. He looked over his shoulder at the darkness behind him, fear rising in his eyes. He stepped closer to the stranger, keeping his voice low. He said that the men by the fire were part of a group searching the hills, looking for something hidden out here that had been lost long ago. He said he had stumbled upon them by accident while passing through and had been caught before he understood what they wanted. The Marais, loyal and quick, had managed to escape with the message. He explained that the men believed the missing object was buried somewhere in these hills. They were desperate enough to search day and night. They didn't want witnesses. That was why they had chased him. Before the stranger could ask more, the Marais raised her head sharply. The stranger followed her gaze. A faint glimmer of light moved between the trees, too steady to be starlight. The men from the fire had seen something. And now they were coming. The man swallowed hard and pointed to a narrow trail leading deeper into the hollow. He said he knew a hiding place nearby, a spot tucked beneath a rock outcrop where they could stay silent until the search passed. The stranger looked at the Marais. She nodded subtly as if agreeing. Whatever danger lay behind them was getting closer by the second. The stranger motioned for the man to take the lead. He moved quickly but carefully, glancing back every few steps to ensure the Marais and the stranger followed. The trail wound through thick brush, branches catching at their clothes. The Marais followed close behind, stepping lightly despite her size. Voices echoed faintly behind them. The stranger's pulse quickened. The search was closing in. A branch snapped under someone's boot, loud enough to cut through the quiet night air. The Marais pressed her head gently against the stranger's back, urging them onward. They reached the rock outcrop. The entrance was narrow, disguised by a curtain of vines and brush. The man pulled the vines aside and gestured for the stranger to enter first. The space inside was tight but hidden from view. The stranger moved in, guiding the Marais carefully. The man came last, pulling the vines back into place. They crouched in the dark, listening. The Marais breathed slowly, her body tense but still. The stranger held the message in their jacket, feeling its weight more than ever before. Outside, the voices grew louder. Footsteps crunched over the brush. One of the men barked an order, sounding irritated and tired. Another responded, saying he had seen something move in the hollow. They searched the area, their torches swinging across the trees. The stranger closed their eyes, waiting for the worst, waiting for a shadow to fall across the vines. But the minutes stretched on. The voices drifted farther away, then faded completely. Only then did anyone inside the hollowed space breathe freely. The man slumped against the wall of the outcrop, exhausted. The Marais lowered her head beside him. The stranger looked between them, understanding that they were involved in something far larger than a lost camp or a runaway horse. The danger was real, the searchers were ruthless, and whatever they wanted from these hills had not yet been found. The stranger touched the cloth again, feeling the message like a promise and a warning. They weren't safe, not yet, and the night was far from over. The hollow under the rock outcrop stayed dark and cramped, holding the three of them together in a silence that felt heavier than the night itself. The Marais kept shifting her weight, brushing her shoulder gently against the stranger, as if reminding them she was there. The man sat with his back pressed to the inner wall, his breathing shallow but steady. Every time a branch cracked outside or the wind pushed through the brush, all three of them tensed, waiting to hear if someone had returned. After what felt like an hour, the stranger finally whispered to the man, asking him to explain everything he knew. The man hesitated, glancing toward the Marais before speaking softly. He said he had been traveling alone when he noticed strange tracks near the creek days earlier. They weren't animal tracks. They were too organized, too heavy. He followed them out of curiosity, thinking maybe a group of settlers had passed through. Instead, he found an old campsite hidden between the hills. Someone had been digging there. Not recently, but long enough to leave the ground unsettled. He didn't realize anyone was watching him until he heard voices behind him. The men claimed he had disturbed something important. They didn't tell him what it was. They only told him he shouldn't have seen it. He said they argued among themselves constantly. Some wanted to chase him off. Others insisted he had already seen too much. That disagreement gave him the chance to escape with the Marais. She had stood close to him since he found her injured near the creek. He had cared for her and she had trusted him. When the men caught up and things turned violent, he managed to slip the cloth into her saddle and let her go. The Marais ran straight toward town, carrying Hope with her. The stranger listened closely, replaying every detail while thinking about the men they had seen by the fire. The message, the anger, the desperate search in the dark. Whatever they wanted was buried in these hills, but the stranger still didn't know what it was or why they were so frantic to find it. The man lowered his head and admitted he didn't know either. He only knew they believed they were close. Close enough to risk everything. Outside, the wind picked up again. The branches scraped against the rocks with a hollow sound that made the stranger's pulse spike. The Murray pressed closer, her breath warm against the stranger's arm. She didn't want them staying here any longer. The danger was still too close. The man studied the narrow entrance and then suggested they move before dawn. He said the group never stayed in one place long, but during daybreak their guard was weakest. The stranger agreed. Staying hidden until sunrise felt like the only choice they had left. Hours crawled by. The stranger shifted just enough to keep their limbs from falling asleep, careful not to disturb the mare. When the first pale glow of dawn touched the edges of the vines outside, the man motioned for them to follow him quietly. They slipped through the entrance one at a time. The early morning air was cold and sharp, filling their lungs with a new sense of urgency. The mare raised her head, scanning the trees. Her ears twitched constantly, catching every tiny sound. The stranger trusted her instincts more than anything else. She started walking toward a slope that led deeper into the hills rather than back toward Willow Creek. The man nodded in agreement, saying they needed to stay out of sight. The group searching for them was likely spread across the area by now. They moved quickly but carefully, avoiding open clearings. The stranger kept one hand on the mare's mane, grounding both themselves and her. After some time, the man pointed toward a cluster of dark boulders, shaped like they had once been part of a single mountain wall. He said there were old trails around that area, paths used long before any town existed. If the group searching believed something valuable was buried here, these trails might lead straight to it. The stranger studied the land. The hills had a quiet beauty in the early light. The grass swayed in long, slow waves. Birds began their morning calls. It felt strangely peaceful, considering the danger hiding within it. The Murray quickened her pace, pushing forward toward a narrow pass between two ridges. As they entered the pass, the stranger noticed something unusual. The ground was disturbed on both sides of the trail. Not fresh digging, but marks from recent movement. Someone else had passed through this place not long before them. The Murray stiffened again. She lifted her head and let out a sharp breath. The stranger lifted a hand, signaling everyone to stop. They listened. The world went quiet. Then came a faint sound carried by the wind. It was metal striking stone. A soft clink repeated slowly, like someone carefully digging. The stranger felt the tension rise across their shoulders. The man glanced at them with wide eyes. The mare pawed at the dirt softly, restless. They followed the sound, moving closer with deliberate steps. At the end of the pass, the land opened into a shallow basin surrounded by tall rock faces. A group of men stood near the center, some holding shovels, others keeping watch. They were digging around the largest boulder in the basin, working with a mixture of frustration and hope. The stranger recognized the two men from the fire among them. Their clothes were dusted with dirt, their movements sharp. One of them barked an order, pointing to a narrow crack in the rock. Another man forced a crowbar into the opening, trying to widen it. Whatever they were searching for, they thought it was inside that crack. The Murray let out a low, uneasy sound. It was quiet enough not to alert the group, but the stranger could feel her trembling. She wasn't afraid of the men themselves. She was afraid of what they were about to uncover. The stranger felt that fear too. The air in the basin felt heavy, as if holding a secret locked away for a long time. The man who had traveled with them whispered that they needed to leave before the group spotted them. But the strangers shook their heads slowly. Leaving now didn't feel possible. The men were too close to whatever they wanted. If they found it first, no one knew what they planned to do. The stranger scanned the area, looking for any sign of an advantage. A path, a hiding spot, anything that could help them. The only safe ground was behind the boulders along the edge. They moved behind one of them quietly, the mare following close behind, though she clearly hated the place. Voices rose again in the basin. One of the men shouted that he felt something inside the crack. The others rushed forward. The stranger crouched low, heart pounding hard enough to feel in their fingertips. The man beside them swallowed nervously. Even the Mare's breath grew shallow. The group's leader ordered the crowbar to be pushed deeper. They worked as a team, prying and pulling with all their strength. The rock shifted, groaned under the pressure. Dust lifted into the air, a long, deep sound echoed through the basin. The ground vibrated faintly beneath their feet. Something behind that rock had moved. The men cheered, their excitement bubbling into loud voices. Their leader told them to widen the crack further. The stranger felt the moment tighten, like the air itself had drawn taut. If they succeeded in breaking through, there would be no turning back. The stranger looked at the Mare. She stared back with wide, frightened eyes, as if begging them to do something. Her tail swished sharply. She stepped forward once, then again, almost ready to charge into the basin out of pure instinct. The stranger caught her reins gently, calming her just enough, but she kept pulling, feeling the danger stronger than any human could. More rock broke loose. The men shouted again. One of them claimed to see something inside. The stranger couldn't see it from where they hid, but the way the men reacted made their skin crawl. They weren't just excited. They were overwhelmed, as if they had found something they had been chasing for far too long. The stranger realized the group wouldn't leave the hills until they had whatever was behind that crack. And the moment they got it, anyone who knew they had been searching would be in danger. The man who had escaped, the stranger, even the Mare. None of them were safe until the truth was settled. The group dug faster, the crack widened. Dust poured onto the ground as the rock gave way. The stranger felt the climax drawing nearer, tightening around them like the last breath before a storm. The Mare's muscles coiled beneath her skin. The man looked at the stranger with fear and hope tangled together. Whatever was behind that rock was about to be revealed. Whatever the men had chased across these hills was seconds away. And whatever the Mare had risked everything to warn about was coming to light. The stranger gripped the reins and prepared for what would happen next, knowing the moment the rock split fully open would change everything. The dust had barely settled after the tense standoff when the truth finally began to rise to the surface, clear as the sunrise spreading over the plains. The man who had stepped forward to help the wild horse stood quiet now, his hand resting gently on her neck as if reminding her she was no longer alone. Folks who had doubted him earlier watched with softened expressions, realizing they had misjudged both the horse and the stranger who had risked far more than anyone knew. The horse breathed slow and steady, no longer trembling, and the stranger whispered something to her that only she could hear. It felt like the whole town held its breath, waiting to understand the meaning behind everything that had happened. When the tension finally broke, it was the horse who moved first. She nudged the man as if urging him ahead, and somehow that small touch shifted everything. He walked toward the worried rancher whose missing Mary had been the center of the conflict, and with calm words explained where he had found her, how he had stayed with her through the storm, and how she had trusted him even when she had every reason not to trust anyone. The rancher's hardened face softened as he ran his hand along the Mare's back, seeing injuries he had not noticed before. No one in the crowd spoke as he realized she had not run wild on her own. She had been chased, cornered, and frightened by someone who wanted to take her for purposes that had nothing to do with the life she knew. The truth shook him, and he looked at the stranger with a quiet gratitude that ran deeper than any apology. He thanked the man not only for bringing the Mare back, but for seeing her fear when others had overlooked it. The Mare stepped between the two men, nudging both of them as if she understood that a new chapter was unfolding. The stranger stepped back and said she belonged with the rancher, that he had only done what anyone should do when a creature cried out for help. But the rancher shook his head gently. He said a horse knows better than most where she wishes to stand, and at that moment she stood with the man who had saved her life. The townsfolk watched, waiting to see what the Mare would do next. Slowly, she turned toward the stranger and pressed her head into his chest with a soft sigh. It was a choice no one could deny. The rancher smiled and nodded. He told the man that the Mare had made her decision and that her loyalty was not something to be taken lightly. The stranger, humbled and unsure, said he did not come expecting any reward. But the rancher insisted that kindness deserved something in return. With a steady voice, he offered the man a small piece of land on the far end of his ranch, a place the Mare could roam safely with someone she trusted. The offer surprised the stranger, but the sincerity and the rancher's tone left no room for doubt. Folks murmured in approval, glad to see goodwill overcoming conflict. As the conversation softened, townspeople gathered around the Mare, admiring her strength and gentle spirit. Children stepped closer, marveling at a horse once feared but now calm enough to lower her nose for them to pet. The stranger watched quietly, feeling the weight of the long journey that had brought him here. He admitted softly that he had been searching for a place where he could start fresh, somewhere he could work the land and live with purpose again. He had not expected to find it through a horse who had needed saving as much as he did. The rancher invited him to ride out and see the land the next morning. He said it would be the beginning of something good for both the man and the Mare. The stranger nodded, feeling hope stirring in a way he had not felt in years. The Mare walked by his side as they crossed the dusty street toward the small inn where he had left his bags. The scene felt peaceful at last, like the town had taken a collective breath and finally let it out. That evening, the innkeeper prepared a warm meal and listened as folks retold the story of how the wild horse had begged for help and how the stranger had stepped in without hesitation. Their voices carried a tone of respect that had not been present just days earlier. Word traveled fast through the town, and soon everyone knew about the bond forming between the man and the Mare. It became a symbol of trust, compassion, and the unexpected ways life could bring people together. The innkeeper said the stranger had given the town something more important than they realized. He had reminded them that kindness had power, even in a place where hardships often overshadowed simple acts of good. The next morning, the sky glowed gold as the stranger stepped outside. The Mare was waiting for him, standing calmly near the corral as if she had known he would come early. He approached her with quiet steps, grateful for the trust she had shown. She lowered her head and let him place a gentle hand on her nose. Moments later, the rancher arrived on horseback and greeted him with a friendly smile. Together they rode across the fields, the Mare following close beside. The land stretched wide beneath the morning sun, offering a sense of promise that grew stronger with every mile. When they reached the far end of the ranch, the stranger saw open pastures, rolling hills, and a small creek cutting through tall grass. It was peaceful, untouched, and full of possibility. The rancher explained that he had kept this area unused because he never found the right person to work it. Now he believed it was meant for someone who understood the value of patience and care. The stranger felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. He accepted the land with heartfelt gratitude, promising to honor it and treat it with the respect it deserved. The Mare trotted across the field and stopped near the creek, glancing back toward the men as if inviting them to follow. They walked toward her, feeling that the land already held a sense of belonging. The stranger realized this place was more than just soil and grass. It was a new start, shaped by a horse who had trusted him enough to ask for help. He knew there would be challenges, but he also knew he would not face them alone. As the sun rose higher, the rancher returned to his home. Leaving the stranger and the Mare to explore their new beginning, the Mare stayed by his side, her steps steady and calm. The stranger looked out across the land, feeling hope take root deeper than ever before. It was a moment of quiet victory, the kind that settles into a person's spirit and stays with them for a lifetime. The story of the wild horse and the man who saved her spread far beyond the town. Travelers passing through heard it at the local diner or from ranch hands repairing fences. They would often ride out to see the man and the Mare working the land together. The visitor might find them near the creek, planting seeds, repairing a gate, or simply standing in the shade of a cottonwood tree. No matter when they came, the bond between the two was clear. Over time, the land flourished under the stranger's care. Grass grew stronger, crops took root, and the creek ran clean through the pasture. The Mare thrived too. Her wounds healed completely, and she moved with a confidence she had not shown before. She became known as the guiding spirit of the ranch, a symbol of healing and renewal. Folks often said that the man had saved the Mare, but the Mare had saved the man in return. Seasons passed, and the ranch became a place of peace in the region. The stranger welcomed neighbors and travelers with warmth, offering food from his harvest and stories from his journey. Although his past had once been weighed down with loneliness, the present was full of purpose. The mare stayed with him through every change, always watching, always guiding, always reminding him of the moment their lives had crossed for the better. The townsfolk continued to admire the stranger, calling him a good-hearted soul who had shown courage when it mattered most. They never forgot how a wild horse had begged for aid and how the man who answered her call had changed the direction of many lives. His story became a quiet lesson passed down to children who grew up around the ranch. They learned that compassion could open paths no one expected and that strength came not from force but from understanding. In the end, the rancher's gift had shaped more than a new home. It had created a place where kindness lived, where trust grew, and where a wild mare found safety beside the man who once risked everything to help her. The stranger often stood at the edge of the pasture during sunset, watching the mare graze among the golden grass. He felt at peace, knowing he had found where he belonged. The wind carried the soft rhythm of horses moving across the land, and every sound reminded him that life had brought him exactly where he needed to be. It was a happy ending built from patience, courage, and a bond that could never be broken. The mare lifted her head and walked toward him, her calm steps echoing the quiet promises of the land they now shared. Together they faced each day with the knowledge that hope could grow anywhere, even in the most unexpected moments. The stranger placed his hand on her neck, grateful for everything she had brought into his life. It was the perfect close to a journey that had started with a cry for help and ended with a home full of purpose, peace, and belonging.